Anybody in the world, but why you gotta tell a poet? Police supposed to protect us, but tell me why them niggas blowing. It's supposed to be sunshine, but why it keeps snowing? Cause we the 12 lost tribes of Israel, the one that y'all sent for. Black is just a color, African American is too red, motherfucker. And that Stockholm syndrome, you need a ride for your brother. But I know, it can get hard sometimes. Deuteronomy 28 and 54, Deuteronomy 28 and 64. And we the 12 lost tribes for sure. We must have called amnesia. I know, it can get hard sometimes. Deuteronomy 28 and 54, Deuteronomy 28 and 64. We the 12 lost tribes for sure. We must have called amnesia.
A boy last week, who was 16 in San Francisco, told me on television. Thank God we got him to talk. Maybe somebody will start to listen. He said, I got no country, I've got no flag. Now he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. Now we're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or some abstraction called the Negro problem. These are Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says and don't feel they have any place here on the basis of the performance of the entire country.
But now, Jim...
No, am I exaggerating?
No, I certainly could not say that you're exaggerating.
Regentrification. Gentrification is when wealthier newcomers move into a working class neighborhood, highlighting new businesses and entities often pop up to cater to those new residents.
Gentrification is constantly being talked about. In the past 10 years, the number of Google searches for the word gentrification has more than doubled, and mentions in the news and in literature have gone up. So, people are talking about gentrification, but they often mean different things when they use the term. Gentrification is a process of neighborhood change that includes economic change in a historically disinvested neighborhood by means of real estate investment and new, higher-income residents moving in, as well as demographic change, not only in terms of income level, but also in terms of changes in the education level or racial makeup of residents. Gentrification is complex and needs some explaining. To understand it, there are three key things to consider: the historic conditions, especially policies and practices that made communities susceptible to gentrification, the way that central city disinvestment and investment patterns are taking place today as a result of these conditions, and the ways that gentrification impacts communities. Over the last century, many policies and practices have created racialized patterns of disinvestment in city centers that have left low-income communities of color particularly susceptible to gentrification. From the 1930s through the late 60s, standards set by the federal government and carried out by banks explicitly labeled neighborhoods home to predominantly people of color as risky and unfit for investment. This practice, now known as redlining, meant that people of color were denied access to loans that would enable them to buy or repair homes in their neighborhood. Other housing and transportation policies of the mid-20th century fueled the growth of mostly white suburbs and the exodus of capital from urban centers, in a phenomenon often referred to as white flight.
So basically, they moved the Negro families into the ghetto. Ghetto being a Hebrew word, meaning the poor place where Jews live.
Take the GI Bill as an example. The program guaranteed low-cost mortgage loans for returning World War II soldiers. But discrimination limited the extent to which black veterans were able to purchase homes in the growing suburbs. In fact, the Federal Housing Administration largely required that suburban developers agree to not sell houses to black people in order for the developers to access these guaranteed loans.
However, regentrification isn't as complex. which is the resurrection and upgrading of a deteriorated urban property by middle class or affluent people, often resulting in displacement of the lower class income people.
The Department of Housing and Urban Development and the federal government writ large in the first 7 decades of the 20th century invested billions of dollars in racial segregation and concentrated poverty. Each time this country created a peculiar institution that subordinated Black people, slavery, Jim Crow, it created and dismantled it. They replaced it with another one.
Left behind in central city neighborhoods, low-income households and communities of color bore the brunt of highway system expansion and urban renewal programs, which resulted in the mass clearance of homes, businesses, and neighborhood institutions, and set the stage for widespread public and private disinvestment in the decades that followed. In more recent history, the foreclosure crisis also contributed to neighborhood-level vulnerability to gentrification. In low-income communities of color, disproportionate levels of subprime lending resulted in mass foreclosure, leaving those neighborhoods vulnerable to investors seeking to purchase and flip homes in bulk.
Venture capital money is when the state or city takes money and invests into disinvested communities, which in 87.3% of these times being urban communities, or for a better understanding, Negro communities. Now, the idea is to be for those same tenants living in that neighborhood. Instead, they sell or rent to what we would consider a more upscale family.
Today, both people and capital are flooding back into these historically disinvested neighborhoods. One reason new people are moving into these neighborhoods is because of their relative affordability. In many U.S. cities, the rental market has gotten increasingly expensive, and even moderate-income earners are on the hunt for lower housing costs. This means that in some places, they are looking in historically disinvested communities, often the same neighborhoods previous generations left behind during the days of white flight. These neighborhoods are often characterized by older historic housing stock that appeals to new residents and close proximity to city centers, where jobs, restaurants, and art spaces are increasingly locating. Cities are also investing in revitalizing some of these neighborhoods, for example with improved transit access and infrastructure, in part to draw in newcomers. On the ground, gentrification may look like real estate speculation, with investors flipping properties for large profits, as well as high-end development, and landlords looking for higher-paying tenants. Increased investment in neighborhood amenities like transit and parks. Changes in land use, for example, from industrial land to restaurants and storefronts. And changes in the character of the neighborhood, as community-run businesses are replaced by businesses catering to new residents' needs. While increased investment in an area can be positive, gentrification is often associated with displacement, which means that in some of these communities, longtime residents are not able to stay to benefit from new investments in housing, healthy food access, or transit infrastructure.
And with that, thus we get regentrification. Now, if you're wondering what happened to those families that were already there, well, those families move or get placed into what the city or state would consider a more affordable community. Still don't get it? That's all right. No worries. Let's not use my words, for example. Let's use the dictionary instead, which is the resurrection and upgrading of the deteriorating urban property by middle class or affluent people, often resulting in displacement of the lower class income people.
It changed dramatically because, you see how it is now. It's all quiet. You don't really see nobody out.
So how could someone like Deshae Wilson, who has lived at his Booth Street home in Milwaukee's River West neighborhood for 37 years, feel like it's not his neighborhood?
This is all I know. This is the only place I've ever lived for ever.
It's not easy to grasp. It's one of those things that happens without noticing. You only see it when you reflect on the time gone by.
How you doing? My name is Deshae Wilson, and this is the east side area known as River West area.
We asked Deshae to show us his neighborhood, how he sees it, to be vulnerable and honest with us. It was up to him what to show us, where to go, and what to talk about. He remembers being friends with his neighbors, but now,
I don't know nobody no more.
because of what he describes as forces beyond his control.
I would say it is a gentrification thing. You come across Holden this way, east, you don't really see too many black families no more. This block, it had, like I say, a lot of ethnic backgrounds on this block. And all the kids, they played with each other, no matter if you was black, white, blue, green, purple.
It's like he's a stranger in his own neighborhood.
Decades of Jim Crow, housing discrimination, and other forms of systemic racism. All of that has led to this: a shocking wealth gap between black and white households in the United States. An average gap of $850,000 that, some experts believe, can be solved by something long overdue: reparations to the descendants of enslaved black people. But how do we even determine who's eligible for reparations? And can the struggle for reparations in other parts of the world teach us anything about what needs to be done in the US? To understand why there's a call for reparations, there needs to be an understanding of the scale of slavery. It was a crime against humanity in which around 400,000 people were forcibly brought to North America. Over the centuries, 10 million enslaved people were legally treated as property in the United States, brutalized and ruthlessly exploited for free labor, which was used to establish the country as a leading global economy. In fact, one historian estimated that by 1860, enslaved people were, quote, worth some $3.5 billion, making them the largest single financial asset in the entire US economy. That's around $115 billion today.
Now stay patient, everybody, because we're still talking about venture capital money, just not one aspect of the venture system.
And I also like you because you want to give $100 million in reparations.
No more than that.
To black people, more than that.
200 to 500 is the number that I sort of landed on.
Woo!
I think that if you look at the historical arc of race relations between whites and blacks in America, I think, I don't believe that the average American is racist. I don't. But I do think the average American is vastly undereducated or underinformed about the history of race in America.
When slavery was abolished in 1865, 4 million formerly enslaved African Americans were freed. But through their forced labor, they created billions of dollars in generational wealth for their captors and none for themselves. Back then, the US government understood the need for reparations and passed an order to distribute 40 acres and a mule to all formerly enslaved families so they could build wealth and financial security. However, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, President Andrew Johnson vetoed the allocation and returned the land to former slave owners.
Issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. While true, the reality of actually freeing those slaves was far more complicated. Today, we're going to take a look at what actually happened on plantations when the slaves were freed. Although free, these ex-slaves typically made deals with their former masters to work for pay. According to Washington, one by one, the older slaves began to wander from the slave quarters back to the big house to have a whispered conversation with their former owners as to the future. Hayes broke the news by saying, "I am about to tell you something I never expected to be obliged to tell you in my life. It is this: one and all, women, men, and children, belonging to me, you are free to go where you please." Smith also noted that at the same time, Hayes was cursing Lincoln's name and exclaiming that if Lincoln were there, he'd kill him for taking his slaves away.
The Department of Housing and Urban Development and the federal government writ large in the first 7 decades of the 20th century invested billions of dollars in racial segregation and concentrated poverty. Each time this country created a peculiar institution that subordinated Black people, slavery, Jim Crow, it created and dismantled it. They replaced it with another.
So I'm going to touch on this slightly, on the numbers of missing men, women, and children in the Black community. The numbers and statistics that are around the world will shock you.
We saw her on camera, the last image of her is on camera with a bag of food, and her eyes look so sad.
I kept asking myself, why her? Why couldn't it have been me instead of her?
We've seen a lot of African American girls that have gone missing, and very little visibility is brought to their case. For 2 weeks, we said she did not run away. And for 2 weeks, they kept saying she ran away. On January 12th, 2018, my 16-year-old niece, Jolie Musa, went missing. She came home with her sister and then was getting some random text messages from somebody, we don't know who. And at that moment in time, she was like, I'll be right back. I gotta go, I'll be right back. Unfortunately for us, she never came back. When we're telling the police that there's definitely something wrong, she would never be gone like this and completely stop communication. What we then heard was, right now it looks like she left of her own free will. She's a runaway.
Across America, the statistics on missing children show a shocking racial disparity. Only 14% of children in the US are black, but 37% of missing people under 18 are African American. Of all the kids that go missing, over 90% are runaways, according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
Relisha.
This is 8-year-old Relisha Rudd.
That's good. I can hear him laughing.
She was interviewed by a homeless charity in February 2014.
Shelter give us some place to stay.
She's talking about the shelter where she lived in Washington, D.C.
Say it louder. The shelter give us some place to stay.
4 weeks later, she went missing.
That's Mark, and that's Andy. They put on a good front.
Mary Homerding never suspected her neighbors were child sex traffickers.
They were always polite. They even joked around.
Because they would ride by in a golf cart and wave.
Nobody in this quiet 55 and older mobile home park suspected a group of 6 men had been keeping 2 teen boys in this trailer starting in 2017.
They were really nice, you know, that's what the shocking part is.
Neighbors said they were surprised the men got away with it for so long because the boys were being held in that blue trailer just a few feet away from the neighborhood trash containers, which many of the residents of this 600-unit complex used multiple times a week.
I've never seen the kids.
Yeah, as many times I went to the garbage can because they live right across from the garbage can. I never heard anything, never seen anything out of order.
Police say the men in the trailer and another woman in north central Florida used video games and online apps like Omegle, Roblox, and Discord to find and communicate with their victims.
The majority of people playing games are boys, and that's how our boys are lured in.
A 2016 study funded by the U.S. Department of Justice estimates 36% of child sex trafficking victims are boys. The first victim was a 16-year-old boy from Marion County.
The teenage victim in this case was lured away from his family with promises of a better life. Instead, he was moved into a filthy trailer and used as a sex slave for nearly a year.
The boy first met these 2 men, Mark Dennis and Andrew Clements, at their 2017 wedding. Police say he was brought to the wedding by a family friend, Eleanor McGlamory, who is charged with conspiracy in the case. Dennis and Clements immediately started texting the boy using Discord and picked him up at his home 140 miles away 3 weeks later. Police say they disabled his cell phone so he couldn't be tracked, then gave him a new name, birthday, and backstory.
A third of the almost 300,000 girls and women reported missing in the U.S. in 2020 were black. That is according to the National Crime Information Center. And yet those cases often get little attention or are all but ignored by law enforcement and national news media.
Many of us have heard missing white women syndrome, which the late, great Gwen Ifill is believed to have first used. And it basically means in our industry that, you know, the stories of missing white women often get a lot of attention, and the media tends to stay with those stories in a way that they do not with the stories of missing black women or indigenous women or Latinas. Gwen Ifill said that back in 2004. Why is this still a problem today?
Yeah, because I don't think anybody has really thought about, well, why do we not care? Is it that people in media are cold and callous and don't care about the stories? I don't believe that's true. I think there's a lot of bias involved. And missing white woman syndrome, as Gwen called it, and penned it originally, I guess, also includes the wall-to-wall coverage that actually gets communities up in arms to the point where you have people flying themselves to Aruba to help look for Natalie Holloway. So it's not even just the media. It's this idea of like, why do people as a whole just not care? In our documentary, we profile a young woman, a beautiful young woman who's Black, who goes missing. And then a couple of weeks later, Natalie Holloway goes missing. And her aunt describes what it's like to watch the attention that Natalie Holloway, I covered the Natalie Holloway case. What a horrific story for her mom to go on newscast after newscast to beg for information about her daughter. But at the same time, the aunt who's looking for her niece is saying, why does no one care about my niece? And she's reaching out to these news organizations. She's a TV producer. She has some wherewithal about how to navigate. She can't get any attention. And so I think it's about, why do we care about some people and why do we not care about others? I personally believe it's a lot of bias. I know when I've done documentaries, that focus on people of color, Black in America, Latino in America, I've been told, listen, don't make it too Black. Make sure that you don't push away the audience we really care about, which is to say the white audience. So I think there's often a sense of, our audience is this. This is a person who's appealing, attractive, interesting to me as a producer. And, and therefore that's what should get the focus versus thinking about what are the communities that you serve and how do you serve those communities. In our doc, we talked to a former news president who says, race is not a factor. That is just not true. That is just absolutely not true. The data does not hold that up.
Okay, so let's take a look at the wealth in America and how America's wealth is spread out amongst its citizens. Keep in mind, these census are only percentage dollars on the amounts from 2018 on up until now, 2022.
In 2018, Wealth in America for white family incomes in comparison to blacks, it found that white families made an average of $171,000 a year. Black families made an average of $17,000 with 2 or more children. That's an $83,071 gap each year. On an average of $17,000 or even $24,000 a year will undoubtedly keep you from building wealth through assets like a car with its insurance and repairs, or even help build credit through car payments. Did you know from 2017 to 2022, a new home for a family had increased from $391,900. In 2021 to 2022, a new home was $453,700. So these increases aren't so-called blacks, as we're beginning to see.
And so I think until newsrooms are willing to say, why do we not care? Maybe we should examine that. I don't know that you're going to get a lot of movement.
Soledad, in the law enforcement angle, is it the same issue at play there? Bias or less incentivized to follow these stories?
I think so, and also a little bit about runaways. Many folks told us in the process of this documentary that the police would sort of push back and say, she's probably a runaway. Maybe she went to stay with her boyfriend. The idea that someone can be in a motel with their abuser covered with bite marks and only because of a chance call is able to be saved is just too horrible to kind of wrap your head around. People should be searching. But if you call someone a runaway, suddenly there's much less of an interest in thinking that maybe you can help find them. They've run away. The folks at Black and Missing Foundation would say no one should be characterized as a runaway. If you're missing, you're missing. And that search should start immediately. Someone shouldn't be sent home to say, maybe they'll turn up, let us know in a couple of days. We all know that the first 48 hours, obviously, are critical in gathering information about a person who might be missing.
Well, it's a fascinating series, necessary storytelling, and the 4-part HBO documentary series, Black and Missing, debuts tonight on HBO and HBO Max. Executive producer Soledad O'Brien, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And it's a story that deserves much more attention.